Thank you all so much for coming out tonight. My name is Amali, and I'm the events coordinator here at Books Are Magic. Before we get started tonight, I just have a few logistics to point out for how tonight's going to go. First off, we do ask that you keep your mask on at all times while at this event. We will be doing a hand-raised audience Q&A towards the end of the event, so please start thinking of questions to ask. After the talk tonight, Lydia will be signing and personalizing books at the desk behind me near the side door. We also have additional books available to purchase for tonight, including several of Leslie Jamison's backlist titles. All right, so with all that in mind, we are so very excited to introduce Lydia Conklin and Leslie Jamison, who are here celebrating the release of Lydia's debut short story collection, Rainbow Rainbow. The stories in Rainbow Rainbow introduce us to a myriad of queer, trans, and gender nonconforming characters. This collection is all at once a celebration of queer joy and love, an examination of identity and self-knowledge, and a reminder that we're all stumbling and surviving through this chaotic time, as many of the characters are as well, and that's okay. I could talk about this collection for far too long, but I'll try to keep it brief by saying that reading Rainbow Rainbow in the sun this weekend at the start of Pride Month was an emotional roller coaster in the best, most thought-provoking and affirming way possible, and I'm sure many of you out there have had similar experiences reading through these incredible stories. Lydia Conklin has received a Stegner Fellowship, a Rona Jaffe Foundation Writers Award, 3 Pushcart Prizes, a Creative Writing Fulbright in Poland, a grant from the Elizabeth George Foundation, scholarships from Breadloaf, and fellowships from Emory, McDowell, Yaddo, Hedgebrook, Gerasi, and elsewhere. Their fiction has appeared in Tin House, American Short Fiction, and the Paris Review. They've drawn comics for The New Yorker, The Believer, Lenny Letter, and elsewhere. They are currently the Zell Visiting Professor of Fiction at the University of Michigan. And as I mentioned earlier, Leslie Jamison joins Lydia in conversation tonight. Leslie is the New York Times bestselling author of 2 essay collections, The Empathy Exams and Make It Scream, Make It Burn, as well as a critical memoir, The Recovering, and a novel, The Gin Closet. She is a contributing writer for the New York Times Magazine and teaches at Columbia University. She lives in Brooklyn with her daughter. So without any further delay, please join me in welcoming Lydia and Leslie.
Well, thank you so much for that so nice intro, and to everybody for coming to my reading. So I'm just going to start by reading for about 8 minutes from the beginning of a story in the collection called Cheerful Until Next Time. The Queer Feminist Book Club came to an end. Asher sat with the 3 other members on his rug that looked clean only at night, never under the sharp winter Atlanta sun that pressed down now from the skylight. Brunch debris littered his living room. Dilly, the group's resident English PhD candidate, confirmed what she'd announced at the last meeting. They'd reached the terminus of queer feminist literature, at least that which was available in English. Are you sure, though? Ivan asked, picking at the bottom of his shoe. There must be more books, said Asher. Dilly shook her head. What about Away We Fly? Ivan asked, winking at him. Asher shivered in delight. Ivan took a special interest in Asher during book club. Mostly, Asher was sure, because Asher was the malest person present. Outside the ecosystem of the meetings, Ivan barely responded to Asher's texts. But even if Asher had been assigned male at birth, Ivan, with his boyish face and mischievous mouth, his black flop of hair and long athletic body, perpetually relaxed in crisply fresh cotton sweaters, would have been miles beyond his league. Away We Fly is not feminist, Dilly said, fluffing her bushy red ponytail. What about Hegar's mouth? Asked Hera. Hera's queerness had not yet manifested, but was the subject of speculation among the 3 other members. Why was she there? In what way could she be queer? This sturdy woman, 40 at least, the director of some youth program, short and serious and earnest, hair gleaming against her scalp, coiled at the neck like a pretzel. Decidedly anti-feminist, said Dilly. Anti-feminist? Asher had loved Hegar's mouth, had been roused by the private world of men he'd hoped to someday join. That's ridiculous, Dilly, Ivan said, shaking back his thick hair. It's a decent choice. If Dilly were to listen to anyone, she'd listen to Ivan, who was doing a PhD too in political science. If women do not exist in a given world, Dilly said, that world as we know it is anti-feminist. Worse, anti-woman. Fine then, said Hera. What about Grim Follies? Sorry, no. Dilly stretched her soft bluish neck. She presented as any sassy nerd until you learned she was Atlanta's lesbian Casanova. That's why Hera, ambiguously straight, was the only other girl in book club. Every lesbian in 3 adjacent zip codes had been through the ringer of a 10-day average affair with Dilly, and in its wake could not be prevailed upon to join. It follows a lesbian giantess, Ivan put in. What's more feminist than that? I didn't say it was anti-feminist, Dilly said. Grim Follies is nothing if not feminist. It was engineered by committee for the new feminist audience that was predicted pre-election. Don't talk about the election, Ivan said. This is the one place we don't talk about the election. Then don't bring up Grim Follies. Dilly rubbed a dry patch by her mouth, chafing from her latest affair. Grim Follies is inextricable from the election results we thought we'd have. But why isn't it a queer feminist text? Asher asked. Dilly closed her eyes. Because it doesn't actively queer anything. How can it not? Hera was flustered. She was the newest member of the group. Dilly and Ivan had run it alone during their undergrad at Brown and their first years at Emory, reading through the canonical works before they recruited Hera, Asher, and Rachel from the Queerlanta subreddit last winter. Lesbian giantesses, Ivan said. Come on, one of them has sex with a tree. Such an epic scene. Asher snuck him a smile, pushing his jaw out to look manly. Asher wasn't on tea. He didn't want to go bald or get cancer and didn't appreciate facial hair or rough skin. Without it, he rarely passed, even after he'd trained his voice down an octave. Asher's ideal boy self was 16. That was why he kept his hair so shaggy. Ivan requested updates through Asher's transition, which filled Asher with fuzzy warmth. Ever since top surgery 2 months ago, he was receptive to the excitement, unlike before, when every good thing had been cursed. Fantasy can't be queered because it is queer by nature, said Dilly. All fantasy lit is pre-queered. Hera bowed her head in defeat. No one knew her well enough to comfort her. If Asher hadn't been new to the group, he'd have told her not to take Dilly seriously. Then I guess this is our last meeting, said Ivan. See you shits over the rainbow, said Dilly. That was exactly what Asher had expected Dilly to say. He'd anticipated this entire evening, Dilly's announcement, the book suggestions, and he was ready with a plan. Wait, he said, as Dilly reached for her keys. What? Asked Ivan. Asher gulped a steadying breath. He was doing this. There's one last queer feminist text. Yeah, right, said Dilly. Really, it's called Cheerful Until Next Time. The members consulted their phones. There's nothing under that title. Ivan shook his phone in a dusty ray of sun, beside some cult band from the 80s. I know. Asher pulled a stack of 4 booklets, rubber banded together, from his horse print backpack. Here are the only copies. He pressed them to his chest, still tender from surgery. He'd been provided anti-scarring gel, but had only used it once. He cherished the reminder that his body wasn't his birthright. At a sweltering book club a few weeks earlier, Asher had flaunted his bare chest. Ivan had said his scars looked badass and had asked whether Asher had pictures of his old body. Asher had tried to joke his way out of it, but finally had shared his single photo, snapped minutes before he went under anesthesia, in a panic that he'd forget his old self. Ivan had tipped his head back as though the picture had spat on him. Shit, dude, that's so not you. He handed the phone back, having already clicked away, cheeks shiny with gratitude. What you're doing is amazing. So Ivan did like him, so there was a chance. The hell is this? Dilly turned the slim booklet over in her spidery hands. The last queer feminist text in human existence. Asher's heart battered his throat. But it's unpublished, said Dilly. Did you write this? Ivan raised an eyebrow. You know I'm not a writer. Ivan flicked the imageless cover. Cheerful until next time. That's so you, though. Asher's skin tightened. Whatever Ivan meant, at least he was thinking about Asher. Make a case for this, Asher, sweetie, Dilly said, before we waste our time on some zine. It's not a zine, Asher said. It's one continuous piece, full of mysteries, riddles, and the stuff of life. Ivan honked out a genuine laugh. Dilly peeled open the first page. Stop, Asher said. Don't read it. Why? Mercifully, Dilly let the volume snap shut. Sweat stuck in Asher's hairline. He'd been certain the intrigue of the booklet would suffice. Who wouldn't be curious about the 15 folded pages, bound with covers cut from grocery bags, the interior typed and stapled up the spine, still reeking of photocopier ink? Asher had printed it in the department late at night when the administrator wouldn't poke in and awkwardly flirt, proving she was progressive by accepting him as male. All the time he'd formatted and copied and folded and stapled, he'd imagined Ivan reading it and falling in love. It's not the kind of thing you want to read around other people. You mean it's sexually explicit? Dilly asked in her favorite sultry voice. Asher couldn't stand it if the group thumbed through the booklets in front of him, Dilly reading a line out loud, Hera chuckling, and Ivan, no. His plan could only work if Ivan absorbed the content alone. And Asher had already tried everything else. He hadn't won Ivan by staring at him during meetings, or by texting him at 2 a.m, or by studying critiques of the books they read so he'd have the sharpest comments. He hadn't won Ivan by wanting him all the time, even back a year ago when Rachel lay next to him in bed. He hadn't won him by Googling him in secret and raising topics that might appeal. Hockey, because Ivan had played as a kid. Dungeons and Dragons, ditto. Wisconsin, because he'd lived there. Beer and cheese, because of Wisconsin. Felony riots, because he'd been charged with one years ago at the Republican National Convention in St. Paul, and his mugshot was still posted way down the results. He was so hot in that mugshot, with his crew cut and his shoulders sagging, holding the placard like it weighed days. So if none of that had worked, then what? Then this piece of writing that was more intimate than anything he'd ever written himself.
Hello.
Hi.
It's so great to hear you read.
Thank you.
Yeah, I've been so excited to talk to you about these stories because there's so much that I love about them, and if it won't terribly embarrass you, I'm just gonna take 1 minute and say some of what I love. I'm sure that everybody here already has their things that they love, but so much of it was actually really present in what you just read. I love how these stories capture what it feels like to be alive and awkward. I was telling you this over email when I was trying to describe the stories. I was like, I got so inarticulate because I was like, they just tell you what it's like to be alive. And then you were like, that's what I'm trying to do. And I was like, oh, good, I'm glad. But those ways that we yearn against ourselves or towards what we might actually want. I'm thinking of that moment where Hazel, who's a young teenager, has this moment where she's listening for voices in the future of people she doesn't even know yet, and I was like, yes, I have lived inside of that yearning. And also these stories are so funny, and they're so interested in relationships that we don't have easy categories for. Like Ivan and Asher are actually a great example. Like the relation of the crush, or the relation of the kind of person who comes into your life but isn't there for good, but changes you forever anyway. You find language and ways of writing about these fleeting encounters and how they shape us. And so I'm so excited to ask you a ton of questions and hear other people's questions. My daughter gave me this just as I was freaking out about wearing black and white to this rainbow reading. She gave me this rainbow fan as I was walking so she's here in spirit with us. And I wanted to start by asking about animals, if that's okay. There are a lot of amazing animals in these stories.
Yeah, that is true. There are many animals.
And I know
do love animals.
the animals are all over your cartoon work. I mean, you're one of the great modern scribes, I think, of animals.
Oh, good.
Yeah. But I guess I'm curious, and maybe you can even talk a little bit about some of the animals that are in these pages. What do animals allow you to explore? What do writing people's relationships with animals, what does that let you get at?
Well, it's interesting because actually an early project for this book was me trying to write every story having an animal in it, because I was interested in how like animals used to be, like in the olden days, a huge part of our daily lives, and we would rely on them for everything, and now they have this kind of shadowy remnant of impact on our life, but can come in strange ways. So like there was a story that didn't end up in the book about like two teenagers who hear that there's like some ambergris on the beach, which is like this very valuable whale vomit, and they go searching for it. And so that was like, that's a random way in which like animals can be tied to like wealth and possibility for people who were struggling queer teens. So some of those stories ended up in the book, but not all of them. It ended up not really being the project of the book, but it's still like a shadowy motif that like remains in there.
And do you find yourself, like, as you're in the process of writing characters or getting to know characters, do you find yourself discovering certain things about them through how they relate to the animals that they share their stories with, or what they want from them, or what comes out when they engage with them?
Definitely, yeah. Like I think we put a lot on animals, and when I was living in New York City after college, I fostered 40 dogs over the course of 4 years, and I like just like found out like, wow, we put so many of our neuroses into these animals, and like I would get these used dogs, who knows who owned them before, but they had been implanted with like all kinds of strange habits and neuroses and fears that humans had put on them. So I think that like in Cheerful Until Next Time, there used to be a flying squirrel, because my brother got a flying squirrel for his kids, and they smell very bad. Like there's like a time of night when they start to release a hormone, and it's like, whew, that's not good. But in the story, Asher had this flying squirrel that like had been his girlfriend's, and so like the text that's the last queer feminist text is like a journal entry from his girlfriend that he's disseminating, and so the flying squirrel was kind of like standing in for like what remained of their relationship, and she had insisted he put like a shirt in the cage that would smell like her, but he wasn't doing it, so he was like, yeah, like the relationships were pressing in on the animal and being put on it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, there's a lot of desire pressing in on animals, I think, throughout, and some loneliness too. And well, what we heard aloud was beginning to get at one of the kind of messes maybe that your characters get into sometimes, which is one of my favorite things about reading these stories, is like watching people get into messes and then trying to figure out what's going to happen to them. And I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about, I had a writing teacher who once said, some version of like, never let characters get exactly what they want, or get away with a character wants to be alone, don't let them be alone. Mm-hmm. And like all advice, it's probably not always to be followed, but I do feel like part of the truth in that is like, what happens when people get into messes. And I wonder if you could say a little bit about like what kinds of messes you got your characters into in this book.
Ooh, that's a good question. Actually, it's funny because I don't know where Maud is here, but her son is like 1 year old, and he like picked up this book, and Maud was like, sent me a video where she was like, what do you think this book is about? And he said, messes. Oh. And I was like, But yeah, I feel like it's that also writing thing of like, you don't want to see people just doing the good and boring things that we do every day. Like, it's more fun to see people who are acting immorally, or like acting wild, or messing up and like going deeper into these problematic situations. And like there's a part in one story which someone pointed out where a character is like talking about how she like spilled red wine on like a carpet at a party and then turned over a platter of deviled eggs to like cover the stain. But it's like, I feel like that kind of is standing in for what people are doing. Like, they're in one bad situation and then they like make it even worse. Like trying to fix it in a like disorganized manner, which I feel like is sometimes like the way of the queer person. I don't know, in my experience. So
yeah, well, and there's the way that like, I wonder how you think about getting them out of messes, or whether you think that that's even something that happens in your story, because sometimes there is this way in which it just keeps getting compounded. It's like, okay, my girlfriend's dog is dead. Like, now I'm gonna get her like little undergrad high. You know, it's like, okay, right, that didn't make it better. But I wonder how you think about like what are the kind of moments, because there's a lot of joy and a lot of connection and a lot of I mean, there's a lot that the characters get to experience in these stories that's also quite lovely. And I wonder how you think about those moments of sort of grace or provision as well.
Ooh, yeah, that's interesting. Yeah, because like I'm thinking about like the end of the first story where like the main character does something very immoral at the end that does get her out of the mess, but probably is the worst possible choice she could have made in that moment to like get out of it, but it does work in a way. Although it creates like a trail of destruction. But yeah, it was like
that's a really good teaser for her story.
Yeah, I think I like so like a lot of like the stuff about the book or whatever that I participated in writing says like use the words queer joy, and there is like you were saying like that in there, and it was really important for me to like not to tell like a different and more nuanced story about queer lives that was more like based on my experiences and that wasn't sort of like this traditional narrative. Like I think a lot of non-majority identity people, if you're writing from a non-majority identity, there's like one tale that's like this is the tale everybody else wants to hear about you guys and we feel comfortable with it and that's what we'll be publishing or putting in movies. And for a long time it was like the character will commit suicide at the end or something, which is like those are stories that are important to tell obviously, but it's like that there's so many other experiences that sort of get shunted to the side because they don't fit into this comfortable tale. So I really wanted to branch out from that, and the joy and the grace was one way, and the other way was like the characters making messes, like you said, and being allowed to be sloppy and human and not being either like the tragic hero or a victorious hero, but just like an actual person in the world muddling through like we're all trying to do.
Those are the stories that I want to read, so I'm glad that you wrote some really great ones. And I think this is actually really connected to what you were just saying about some of the desires you brought to writing about queerness. A lot of the stories feature some kind of role play, right? Like really explicitly in your amazing story about Oregon Trail live action role play, which is just an incredible small masterpiece. But also, meeting an older lesbian online, like the internet persona as a kind of role play, or even in the first story, kind of playing the part of being a person in a relationship who wants a child, right? Like this is this like experience that many people go through in adulthood, but there's a way in which the character is sort of trying to role play a version of that experience or that desire. And so I wonder how you thought about role play, playing roles, like breaking roles, like both as what's sort of interesting to you about that as something to write into, and how does it allow you to write into something about queerness?
Ooh, yeah.
Part of that.
That's a really good. I like how you just drew that through all the stories. But yeah, like I think, since I'm interested in gender and it's something I've always had to think about. When you have to think about it a lot and it doesn't come naturally to you, I feel like performance is like a big part of it, and like studying other people and like how do I show what's inside, or what am I allowed to show and what am I not. And like the story you mentioned, Pioneer, like that came from a true tale of my life where I was in 5th grade and we were like, it was like, okay, now we're gonna do the Oregon Trail, and it was like, dang, like I could get away with like wearing the boys' clothes and like being a tomboy or whatever, but then it was like, okay, now you're a matriarch from colonial times. It's like you can't really like wear pants. So I was like, but if I dress as a boy, it would be very, obvious. So I was like, oh, I have a good idea. The way to not draw attention to the situation is I'll dress as an ox. That's obviously the worst thing I could. So I think like that was a moment where it's like, oh, okay, like gender role playing and performance is coming in a way, in the historical sense, and exposing things that are happening in the present day. So that was how it kind of like performance and pageantry like connected back to queerness and gender.
Yeah, the turn to oxenhood is like such a fascinating one to follow, and also like seeing the ways in which like, you know, a 6th grade boy like role play seems to allow him to inhabit maybe like an innate cruelty or something. Like now has its like right sized home in this like sort of cruel, you know, lord of the trail cart or whatever it is that he becomes. But I love that story so much, and I'm just gonna see when okay, I'm gonna ask. I have time to ask you a few more, and then we're gonna open it up to you guys. So be thinking of your questions, because sometimes there's like a, you know, it's like quiet in the beginning, and then there's a flood. So be thinking now. So yeah, one of the things I loved most, and I feel like I'm always hungry for when I read and I'm always hungry for narratives of friendship, and I'm always hungry for narratives of relationships that kind of live outside these like standard categories of like parent-child, romantic partnership, like, you know, the ones we read about most frequently. And I feel like so many of these stories are populated by, I guess what I started to think of as like sideways relationships, like acquaintances. Somebody shows up in Poland and like, you know, their sort of strange pseudo tour guide, like that becomes a relationship. Like one night stands show up, like a quarantine hookup shows up, like and you get the sense that a lot of these relationships aren't necessarily, you know, gonna last forever and under whatever terms, but that it matters to be narrating what happens between these people in this moment. And I wonder what excites you about those kind of like sideways or outside of standard category relationships, or kind of those like fleeting moments of shaping encounter.
Ooh, yeah, that's such a good question. I think the root of it is related also to queerness, like the fact that like I don't have like a traditional family or anything, so like friends are like a huge part of my life, or like the weird side relationships or like non-normative relationship structures that I've created in my life. And as a child, like growing up in like the dawn of the internet, like there was just like no, like I was alienated from my family in a certain way because I had this secret about myself that they didn't know, that was like confusing, and like some people at school and whatever. So it's like the friends that I made, some of whom are here, like right here in front of my face. Like so, I don't know, that was so like sustaining and important, and like there was no way to like there was no literature to see the future. There was no internet to look up, oh, someone in Iowa was also gay. So it was just like a very like isolating experience where like I was just kind of like have my friends, and these strange relationships became like so important.
Yeah, well, just the way you put it right now, imagining that possible internet is like gay person in Iowa ? Google, you know, is it makes me think about that line from earlier that I love, that I mentioned that I love so much, of like that high school for all sorts of reasons is like a time that leaves many of us like lying in bed, just steeped in loneliness, like listening for those voices from the future of people we haven't even met yet, but that kind of like listening to voices was a maybe even more acute form of longing in this like pre-internet era too, of just sort of like feeling like there's something out there. And
it's not like I think it's like easier now, because like in one of the stories Sunny talks, there's like a queer teen like in the present day, and he's like dealing with like internet trolls, social media, YouTube discourse, like all kinds of like other Pandora's box of other horrors, but like maybe it's too connected now, and it was not, like I don't know, there's like some echoes, but some like just totally different struggles for queer youth now.
And I think and that is another story actually about, it's nibbling relationship at the center of that story, and that too is like a form of like kind of like the figure of the aunt or something is just one that we read so much less frequently than the figure of like a parent or even a sibling, and so I was so glad to see it given life and complexity and heart in the way that you did.
Oh, thank you. That's funny.
Well, okay, I'm gonna give myself one. I have like this whole page of like process nerd, craft nerd questions because all I want to do is like nerd out with you about crafts. But I'm gonna give myself permission to ask one of them, and then we'll open it out to the crowd. But so this collection was a fairly long time in the making. Is that correct?
Yeah, the oldest story in here is like 12 years old, so it's been a while.
Can you talk a little bit about those 12 years? Like, are there some stories that are early stories and other stories that are later stories, or does each story sort of have its own 12-year history and process of being shaped? Like,
Well, yeah, it is more the first thing you said. Like, some of the stories are older and some are newer, but I think, like, after my MFA, soon after, I was like, oh, I have a book of stories. I have all the pages for a book. And then I was like, I'm done. And then I realized, like, no, I'm not. Because it's like all this, I feel like a few things had to happen that why it took 12 years. And one was, like, just history and time. Like, because, you know, all the laws around queerness, all the mores around it, the discourses, like, the way people feel about it had changed so much that then, like, the way history shaped the characters' lives, like it just added breadth to the collection to like show these different moments in history and the echoes through time of not deep history but the last 12 years or so. And then and I think the other thing was I had a lot of stories where I was basically writing around the same thing, so there'd be these clusters of stories and it was like only one of those can make it into the final book, but then it was like it took so long to like have enough good ones of those.
Yeah, it's amazing that you said both of those are really interesting, and I think sometimes my own drafting process involves like writing the same idea, 20 sentences, 20 ways, and then part of the ruthlessness that's required from revision is like making it just saying that thing once, you know, but it rings so true that stories might be kind of like gathering themselves around a thing, and then you need to choose between them as part of the shaping of a collection. But you probably needed to write all of the stories in the cluster for the one
that
totally chose to do what it did.
Yeah, and they can even exist in the world and not in the same book, but in the same world they can still exist, so that's some comfort. But yeah, I have the same process issue, which is like I write so much that will never see the light of day, and it's like that's just frustrating, but it's just I just have to, I don't know, I just tell people like when my students are frustrated with their process and they're like, I do this stupid thing and like it's the most inefficient, but it's like if it's working for you, you just have to accept it, you have to love it no matter how inefficient, frustrating, ridiculous it seems, because there's not really going to be a better way, sadly.
And there's probably no way that like avoids ridiculousness entirely, or if so, like what would it generate that would be worth reading?
Yeah.
So. All right, well let's try so many questions, but I would love, I think it'd be great to get some from you guys.
Hi, Kyle. Oh, sure. Yeah, so the title of Rainbow, I picked that title because it appears in one of the stories, as I don't want to give it away too much, but in the moment it appears, I felt like it stands for like the whole thing I was trying to do in the collection of like missed connection, fantasy, like loneliness, queerness, like it all kind of comes together in that moment. And then also there's like a hidden rainbow somewhere in each story. So it's kind of like the combo. My friend who read it a while back said it was a bad title, but I I didn't listen, so maybe he was right. Oh, thank you.
I'm glad it's the title.
Julie Rossman?
I just wanted to ask, because I've known you for so long, and I knew you originally as like a visual artist when we would do the painting studios long ago in high school.
Yeah.
And as like a comics person, I was just wondering, like, when you're writing, do you get a lot of visions of your characters, and how do you kind of like, or I guess the question is sort of just like your process in writing, and as such a visual person, like, does it feel overwhelming to visualize the characters like you do in your comics? Does that feel like something that you're ever kind of doing simultaneously, and like what's that relationship like?
Ooh, yeah, that's a good question. Yeah, I do think very visually, like whenever someone's talking about someone, I would like to see a picture to picture in my mind. So like, I think I do, and like the best writing, I feel like that I read of other people's, I can see the scene and I can see the characters, and sometimes I even want to like Google them to see if there's a picture of them, but there isn't because they don't exist. So like, yeah, I think it's important for me. The visuals are very important for me. The smell's not so important because I don't really have a sense of smell. So that's probably stunted sense here. Yeah. Maud?
I'm wondering, because you do write a lot, you did write a lot of stories, and I've always wondered what you start with. Like, what is the thing that starts your idea?
Ooh, that's a good question. Yeah, it changes story to story. Like, for example, there's a story in here called Counselor in My Heart where there's a moment where a dog meets an unfortunate fate and like a bad moment, like Leslie was referencing before, and that incident had happened to a friend's parents, and I was haunted by it, and I couldn't stop thinking about it, and I was like, I want to take that moment that was just like an isolated strange incident and see like what relationships it could press on and what it could kind of like snowball into, like Leslie was saying. And then other times it's like an emotional seed, like with the first story it's like this is sort of a larger question that I'm stressing about, and I wanted to like play it out with characters and like look at all the sides of it and see where it would go. So the question being like, should I have children or not? So that's where that came from. So it's always a different thing. Thanks for the question. Oh,
Hi.
hi.
My question is, what's another one of Leslie's questions about craft?
Got a whole page of them here. But then what you were saying about visuality was making me want to go to another one of my questions. But I'll do my next craft question, which is the question about revision. And I guess, well, one quick thing to say is that like I've been mainly writing nonfiction for like the past decade, and I'm now writing fiction again. And one thing that I'm discovering in revision is that you can revise by changing what happens, which I just hadn't been able to do for so long. And so it made me curious. I just wanted to talk a little bit about revision and like what, I'm sure it's different story by story, but what are some of the kinds of things that happen for you in revision, or what are some of the changes that you make? Like, are you changing the ways characters relate to each other? Are you killing characters? Are you adding animals? Are you killing animals? Are you, adding moments of grace? Like, all of the above? Like,
ooh, yeah, that's so funny because I just had to write, didn't have to, but chose to write a couple nonfiction pieces around the book's publication, and I had never done it before, and I was like, every time I've tried, I've just started making things up, and then been like, dang, it's not nonfiction. So it was so hard. I was like, how do people do this? But yeah, I guess like one example, I think it changed in lots of ways, but one like striking example for me is in the first story. There's like a story that's told that actually comes from our friend Miranda, but her sister, but like about a toddler like getting out of the house and getting on a city bus, and so like the sperm donor tells the story to the main character, and in the original version it makes her decide she doesn't want kids. Like, okay, no, that is too scary. I'm admitting to myself that I'm not going to be able to do this thing. But then Samantha Chang, who think you know, also she was like, is that the most interesting decision that could be made here, like, and that made me think, like, well, what if it makes her realize the opposite thing, like, so I think one way in which I try to revise is, like, what is the most interesting emotional decision that still makes sense emotionally for the characters, but isn't what is expected or what we would think how things would unroll. So that's an example.
I'm gonna take that home with me actually to my revising today.
I'm so excited to read more fiction from you though. That's awesome. Yeah. Okay. Hi.
So I'm a little embarrassed to confess, I actually did not know this bookstore despite living in Brooklyn for a long time. But you said you lived in New York City for a while, and I was wondering if you chose to have this event here because you had spent some time here and it had some significance to you, or if it sounded good, you hadn't been here.
Ooh, yeah. I think that maybe it was Rachel's idea, was it? Or Kira? Yeah, but I mean, I've been to events here and I love this store, and so it was like, yay, but I think they put it together for me and I didn't think of it. Yeah. But I have many good memories of events here, so I felt happy about it.
Do you still lock your phone in a timed safe?
Indeed, I do. I do. Yeah, like I always had this program that shut off my internet while I'm writing for my computer, and I didn't have a smartphone for a while. Then when I got one, I was like, dang, this is distracting. So I have this box that's supposed to be helping people who don't want to eat all the cookies at once, so they can lock it in the box, and I put my phone in it. And I have had to smash it open on a couple of occasions. It's really saved my life, honestly. So I recommend that to anyone.
So the section of the story that you read today, obviously, there's some like very funny parts, and you as a person are very funny in person and in conversation. I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit about the role of humor in the book and what you respond to, what you find funny, and what you think that can do in a story.
Ooh, that's a good question. Yeah, I feel like humor is very important to me. Like I have the dream of things being both funny and sad. So that's the combo I'm going for. And I don't know, I feel like humor can just surprise and startle you into thinking something you didn't expect, or like shake it up. Like that's what I'm trying to do with descriptions too, like Julie's comment, like trying to describe something in a way where you can see it in a new way because it's not the way you're used to hearing it described, so your eye doesn't like gloss over it. And I feel like humor can like just grab the attention in a way. So I do enjoy putting in as much as I can manage. Thanks for the question.
There's a way that humor too, I think, and your humor certainly, it can make you feel as a reader like just fully present, because it's like your guard has been let down. Like I feel like in laughter we're so it's like exposed and we're loosened somehow, and then it's almost like once you're fully present in that way that humor has made you feel just right there with like your nerves exposed, you're so much more vulnerable, to the other part of your combo. So
that's a good point. Yeah, and I think like someone was reminding me of this old thing that's like humor is tragedy plus time, which I didn't remember, but then I was thinking like some of the stories about older times in my life are a little more on the funny side, I feel like, in here. And like there's one, the third story is a very personal tale of COVID and its recent events, and it's like probably the least funny story in the book, and I would wonder if, maybe that's because it's still so raw for me, that experience, that the humor hasn't come in yet. What's that?
What do you read before you write?
like in the morning when I wake up and stuff.
Yeah, or like for inspiration, or who like do you emulate? Who do you read for fun?
I just kind of like read whatever I feel like it. And then, but I find that like some things make me so inspired to write, and like those are the best things that like thrill me, and like it's maybe a tiny part of like not could do this, but maybe like I want to do this, or like, but also just so good, like something that's just so good and resonating with me. I feel like the last thing I read like that maybe was Second Place by Rachel Cusk, which I love so much, and just the writing was so like startling and weird, like the language, and it just, I was listening to it on tape while I was painting a room green, and it actually made it fun. So I think that's a compliment.
I'm taking a lot of life tips from this as well, like to self like paint part of my home green and listen to Rachel Cusk while I'm doing it. Yeah.
I do recommend that.
Allow time to add humor to the tragedies of my life. Like these are good things.
Yeah.
Are there other questions? I thought I saw them.
Oh, Rachel.
If one of the stories in the book was going to be turned into a huge blockbuster movie, which one would you want and why?
I think Sunny Talks maybe, because I feel like it has like a very large and strange cast of characters, and humor and sadness too, both, and I don't know, I just feel like it would be fun. I don't think there's enough movies about conferences. So maybe it could be a whole new genre.
I would see it in a heartbeat. Maybe Rachel can make it happen.
Yeah.
Maybe time for one more. Or do you have one?
I do. I have more than one, but I can take this out with this one that I was actually the one I was mentioning before when you were talking about visuality and seeing things in scene. It was making me think about the worlds of these stories. So they hold a bunch of different worlds geographically. We open with a Laramie story. There's a story set in Krakow. We spend time wandering the streets of Madison in a debauched carnival that reminded me of my own days in the upper Midwestern college town. And then the Boston suburbs get some real play. Government Center gets a cameo, which I'm obsessed with. I'm obsessed with the moment where a character trying to say what she thinks will be cool to another character says, "I love Government Center." One of the funniest ones in the whole movie. But I'm wondering what different places or different worlds or different settings make possible for you. Like, was there what did you feel like could only go down in Laramie or Krakow, or how do you find that different places end up feeling the right home for certain emotional questions or certain kinds of interrogations or certain moods, or how does what does world open up for you in that way?
Oh yeah, that's really good. I think like, well, part of it comes from my own experience, because in the last 12 years, I've moved 9 times into very, very different places, and I feel like it was exciting for me. Going to a new place kind of makes me see everything new. It like makes me write better. It's like exciting, but then it did also get tiring. But I think just the way I was talking about like history and how like the people in the book who are like in the Clinton administration, it's like very different but no less pressing, like fears as like the people just after Trump got elected, or like in the COVID pandemic or whatever. So like, in the same way, like the political situation in Krakow is very different and is going to press on the characters in a different way than the Boston suburbs or Atlanta or something like that. So I think that was part of it, and the other part was like also going through different transition. For some, it's a transition of accepting something about their sexuality or gender, but for others, it's like moving to a new place or going through a breakup or beginning sobriety. So I think that kind of like the eclecticness of place in the book kind of spoke to that kind of thing.
Any question? No? Okay, cool.
Thank you all so much for coming out tonight. Thank you, Lydia and Leslie, for joining us. Thank you to everyone who tuned in virtually on our live stream. We do have additional copies of Rainbow available to in the back. I forgot to mention this earlier, but if you're still tuned in on YouTube, you can buy your copy by clicking the link in the live stream description. Lydia will be personalizing books at the back desk near the side door. We ask that you give them a minute or so to get situated, but then please do make your way downstairs so that our event staff can start to break down the area. That's all from me. Again, thank you so much, everyone. Let's give these two writers another round of applause.